Joining us with this week's Ag Week Market Extra is David Ripplinger. And David, let's talk about the biofuels industry from the perspective of the Renewable Fuels Standard and the erosion that we have seen with that because of these small plant waivers. What has the impact been?
Well, I mean, it's caused a lot of uncertainty in the market. We don't know exactly what's occurred, even though we did receive news in the last 2 weeks that 1.5 billion gallons of RVOs, this allotment to refineries, was essentially waived. But we don't know how those decisions were made, and we also don't know what things are going to look like going forward. We do have a new administrator or acting administrator for EPA, but there needs to be a lot of clarity, including possibly going back and taking care of this mess.
Yeah, and it erodes the renewable fuel standard volumetric levels, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's really unfortunate. The renewable fuel standard, as an economist, was a really well-designed policy and operated relatively well, especially for conventional biofuels, for corn ethanol, since its establishment in 2005 and updated in 2007. Now the integrity of the entire system is really in question. We're still only learning about what happened and those decisions made by EPA and what the ramifications are. And then, of course, what is the RFS going to look like moving forward, knowing that in 2022 it essentially phases out.
Now, there were senators, including Joni Ernst of Iowa and Chuck Grassley of Iowa, asking for Administrator Pruitt's resignation because they said he was the main reason that those were granted. Now, he's gone. Does that change the dynamics or the politics of what happens going forward?
I think it does to some extent. Administrator Pruitt was under a lot of pressure, including for the RFS and other reasons. The acting administrator, I think, is a little bit more savvy in terms of the operation of the agency. The question going forward, to me, and I think to many in agriculture, is, how important is the RFS or is the American farmer to the administration? But I think the acting administrator will be much more receptive to signals and the presidency going forward.
You bring up a good point there, because I do have some producers that say to me, okay, we're beyond the blend wall. Why do we need the renewable fuel standard anymore?
Well, first of all, we're actually not past the blend wall.
Okay.
It's close, right? So right now, regular gasoline in the United States is E10, which is wonderful. So if you go to a gas station, E10 is regular is E10 and at almost all stations, which is great. We tend to have about almost 10% of the ethanol of gasoline use is ethanol. So we're close to that blend wall in many respects. At the same time, our production is now far in excess of use. So right now we have about 16.5 billion gallons of corn ethanol refining capacity. Our production is very close to that. This last week it was 16.3 billion gallons, but we're only using a little over 14 billion gallons here. So the question is, where does that other 2 billion gallons of ethanol go? And it could be domestically, it could be flexible fuel vehicles if you're going to be driving E85, or there's a lot of interest in having a year-round E15 blend available to consumers. And then, of course, going to export markets, building those markets and removing some of the volatility that exists there.
The industry really pushed to get Reid vapor pressure relief for E15 sales this summer. That's not going to happen probably now for another year, but EPA can do that?
They can, absolutely. A lot of consumers and voters aren't familiar with all of the capabilities and demands on EPA, but they do regulate our fuel supply and what our fuel mixes look like. And they are in charge of this Reid vapor pressure issue. They can make a decision to have a waiver for E15.
How much more demand would that create in the marketplace?
At the start, it would be relatively small. Again, then we go to the pump issue. Then we can actually go to the retail issue. It removes that regulatory barrier, but again, we still have to get that fuel to the consumer, and the consumer still has to buy it. It took a decade for E10 to really penetrate the market and become regular gasoline. Now we need to have a new pump, in order, and a new tank in order to have E15, although there might be interest by some to say, well, the new regular is going to be E15. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. And I also think it's going to be challenging to say, well, retail stations, we need you to add another tank and another pump to have E15 available. But again, that's the interest. We're at this point where ethanol is an extremely inexpensive octane source, which is why we see E10, and it's a very reasonable fuel. In addition to its environmental benefits and benefits for rural economies and energy security, it's low cost, and so it's right on that fringe of where it could see a presence at the retail level. But a few more things have to give other than just EPA signing a waiver.
So domestically, that's part of market development. Talk about the export side of it. We've just come off a year of record exports, but we could certainly use more, right?
No, absolutely. And the ethanol export market is really, it's kind of it's an immature market. There's a lot of volatility. We have customers, buyers around the world who irregularly enter the market or behave uniquely. Again, it would really be great to open up new markets as well as to stabilize some of the existing markets. So we know that in a given year that certain trade partners are going to be regular purchasers of U.S. ethanol.
China was a big purchaser, but now we have tariffs on, and those actually went into effect way before the trade war started, right?
They did, absolutely. China with ethanol and distillers grains as well, they've behaved in what I'll call the traditional China trade manner, where they will adjust their tariffs in a way that benefits them. And so, yes, they did increase their tariffs on ethanol before the trade war, essentially stopping U.S. ethanol exports to China. Long term, of course, we'd like to see China open, but there are other large markets for ethanol around the world.
So who has come in and taken the place of some of that lost China business then?
Sure. So, again, it's kind of on again, off again, but, there's a few nations that, kind of jump to the top of the list. We have nations in the Middle East who are going to blend U.S. ethanol with their use. The Philippines, South Korea are usually there, and, of course, Canada.
And as far as the growth in the industry, do you continue to see this market continue to grow here, both on ethanol, but even on the biodiesel side?
It's interesting. So I think in many respects, we've seen the market go through what I always call like the first full chapter. We've seen ethanol find a home in markets, domestically and abroad. We have these refineries built. It's there. Same thing on the biodiesel side, soybean biodiesel. We have, soybean oil that we utilize for the most part to make biodiesel in the United States. Again, the question for me is always, well, what's next? And what's next is market development, both domestically and abroad, which is what we're doing. And then it's further expansion. And I see a little bit of difficulty until we see more clarity. First coming from Washington. What does the RFS mean? Again, the RFS is going to essentially time out in 2022. There's no more strong legs on it after that time. So Washington Congress needs to decide if there's going to be an RFS 3, and if so, what that might look like. And who knows if there's going to be any significant changes on the consumption side. Are consumers going to be interested in an E15? Will it be available at the retail level? And then beyond that, are we going to get to an E20, E30 super octane gasoline maybe by 2030?
All right. Well, great insight to the ethanol and biofuels industry, and thanks for sharing that. David Ripplinger joining us with today's Ag Week Market Extra.